Okay, I'm going to call the meeting of the Planning Commission, 7 p.m. Thursday, June 20th. Can I have a roll call, please?
Rodriguez? Here. Newton? Absent. Gonzalez?
Here.
Barber? Okay, Fregoso? Kierline? Here. Green?
Here.
Chair Swift?
Here.
Did I get everybody? Yes.
Okay, approval of agenda. Do I have anyone have any changes they want to make to the agenda?
I suppose that we would be continuing item 1 to the next regularly scheduled meeting.
Yes, that was going to be staff's recommendation, but you might just check to see if there's anyone in the audience to speak to that item.
Do I have a motion?
Other than the applicant.
Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
I'm sorry.
You said all in favor, aye, and then I was no. Because I
I'm
was
sorry,
that
I'm-
item 1,
I'm
because I
sorry.
was taking the staff recommendation prior to moving that item to see if there's anybody in the audience who's here to speak on that item.
Yeah, I was going to do that when we address that item.
Fair enough.
So meeting protocol, the chair shall maintain order at the meetings in accordance with Robert's Rules of Order, and the commission has responsibility to be a model of respectful behavior in order to encourage community participation and citizen input at commission meetings. The commission and the audience are expected to refrain from using profane language and/or ridiculing the character or motive of commission members, staff, or members of the public, and to maintain the standards of tolerance and civility. We're not going to have public comments on non-agenda items. Anyone wishing to address the commission on matters not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of the commission may do so now. Please state the matter on which you wish to speak. Matters not appearing on the commission's agenda will not receive action at this time but may be referred to staff for a future meeting. Presentations will be limited to 3 minutes or as otherwise established by the commission chair. Persons are not required to give their name or address, but it's helpful for speakers to state their name for the record and whether or not they are a Fairfax resident in order that the secretary may identify them. Is there anyone here who have public comments, wish to speak on non-agendized items?
Good evening. Rick Hamer, Fairfax resident. Wildfires. We often hear about building standards, what to do, how to evacuate. Today I want to use 3 examples of CAL FIRE investigations of how real fires started, illustrating that every second matters, and suggest that a town-wide rapid notification method be the most effective way to save lives of our townsfolk, and plead for rapid notification at the point of occupancy must be done and must take precedence over ordinances which are about lifestyle and property centric. The ranch fire in 2018, the largest fire in California history of 459,000 acres. This fire started because a homeowner was driving a metal stake into a wasp nest. Sparks from hammering metal against metal and stone ignited dry grass. Who would have thunk that? CAL FIRE determined that there was no negligence on the part of the responsible individual. The River Fire, 2018. This fire evacuated the entire population of Lakeport by nightfall of the first day, 5,000 people. Unlike Fairfax, Lakeport has a grid of level streets, wide arterial routes, and a freeway. This fire started because miles away, the metal wheel of a highway vehicle blew a tire, contacted road pavement, sparked, and ignited dry grass along the shoulder. Hey, that tire was fine just up the road. CAL FIRE determined there was no negligence on the part of the responsible individual. The Valley Fire, 2015. This fire destroyed 1,955 structures and homes, including my own. My neighbor walked the trails daily around this home for years. He was physically fit. He used these trails to escape the fire until the fire overcame him and killed him. This was in the first afternoon of a fire that started in the very same afternoon. Walking away on paths should not be the part of any comprehensive plan. This fire was caused by a timer control inside of a hot tub, which when unattended overloaded electrical wiring. Timer, there's a timer. No kidding. The responsible individual did not know. The wiring of the hot tub was not permanently installed. Therefore, this was deemed an act of negligence, but the responsible individual challenged CAL FIRE's finding and no, did not have $1 billion worth of insurance. With none of these examples did the responsible individual even think that their action was about to make history. Simple routine acts. In only seconds, the consequences were irreversible. After fire spread rapidly, these acts resulted in loss miles away. I will tell anyone who will listen that life safety during a wildfire is all about getting a head start. Planning cannot stop the acts or the fires like I mentioned, but how about moving on ordinances that every new permit strengthen our town's early warning on a micro level? The NOAA public alert radios have been a long time. Why not make these into a compulsory model like smoke and carbon monoxide detectors? They too use a theme of early alert. Manufacturers of wall and ceiling detectors like First Alert offer permanent wall-mounted public alert devices too, $30. Give our denizens valuable seconds of notice so they can get a head start and navigate our narrow, winding wooden streets to safety. Please prioritize this discussion about built-in public alerts with every permit. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I have any other individuals wishing to speak during public open time? Seeing none, I'll close public comments. There's nothing on the consent calendar, so we'll go to agenda item 1, 402 Scenic.
Yeah, so one of the commissioners brought to our attention that this project, while it doesn't need an HRD permit, it's still a 50% remodel and it requires a design review permit, which we did not notice it for, and we did not include a discussion of that discretionary permit in the staff report. So we're recommending that this be continued to your July meeting so it can be noticed properly and we can include findings for approval of the design review permit.
Is there anyone here to speak other than the applicant to speak on this issue, this item? Okay, do we need to ask the applicant if he's willing to?
We're still within the time limit, so.
Okay.
And he knows, he understands why it's being continued. You don't want to fight the continuance, do you? Yeah, okay.
Do we need a motion to continue? Okay. Would anyone like to make a motion to continue agenda item 1 to the next meeting?
Well, I was wondering if we could hear from the applicant anyway and then continue?
We wouldn't recommend that because there's
Okay.
not really any point, and it'll be, whatever he has to say, if he wants to say anything, it'll be fresh in your minds when you're actually discussing the whole issue next month. Yeah.
Would anyone like to make a motion to continue the item?
I'll make a motion to continue item 1 of the agenda.
Second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Thank you. Item 2.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the commission. What you have before you is zoning ordinance amendments, which staff has developed in conjunction with our town attorney's office, relating to placing time limits on both planning application submittals and discretionary permit entitlements. Briefly, some background. When the Planning Commission in January of 2018 had a goal-setting workshop, one of the items discussed by the Planning Commission and ultimately recommended as part of the work program going forward was to include certain zoning amendments. And those recommendations for zoning amendments were forwarded to the town council, who ultimately supported these amendments. One of the more important ones from a staff standpoint anyway, is to adopt what many jurisdictions have, as we found out in doing our research, which is to place a reasonable limit on the amount of time that incomplete applications can remain incomplete and on file with the department, and also when an application has been approved, to limit the amount of time that those approvals and entitlements can remain valid prior to an applicant having to apply for a building permit. As discussed in some length in the staff report, there's a variety of factors why staff recommends that we adopt such an ordinance. One of the most compelling ones is the fact that in its absence, you have applications that literally go into limbo indefinitely. I think there's one application, at least one anyway, that's been on file in a more or less inactive state since 2011. So although not typical, you will end up with these projects. Another reason to do that is that rather than remaining inactive indefinitely, which most of them do, occasionally after a period of years, an applicant will come in with at least some additional information that he or she believes was what was requested and wishes to reinstate an application. As your commission is aware, we are in the process of modifying our regulations annually. I mean, that there are a variety of changes. For example, as of, the beginning of July, you will no longer be able to newly apply for a house that exceeds 3,500 square feet. So if somebody had had an application on file that was incomplete, that was greater than what the new maximum size is, staff would be left with the unenviable task of explaining to an applicant that they can no longer apply for such an exceedance, or would have to go through what would now be an exception process. So this is an example of when things get really stale, regulations change, and sometimes you can't even apply for what was originally within the scope of the zoning. Or if you can apply for it, the policies have changed to now discourage it. What happens then, of course, is an applicant who's got letters on record from the town which don't refer to the new regulations feel as though they've been whipsawed and victimized because now they're getting this what they consider a late hit. Needless to say, the process doesn't work very well in those situations. Another aspect is that we're very fortunate to have sitting to my left a planner of outstanding tenure and service to the town of Fairfax. What's much more common is for staff to have a reasonable turnover in a matter of years. And what happens when you have, for example, this 2011 application, which the principal planner here is personally familiar with and was able to find and date, what you typically have is nobody with any recollection of such a project. So they're digging into that project anew, as it were. Even if a planner was the original planner assigned, after a period of many months or, as the case may be, years, there is a complete lack of familiarity with the process. So what you're basically doing is starting over from zero, except as noted earlier, there are expectations by the applicant that you can pick up an application midstream and proceed diligently forward, ignoring the fact that all sorts of regulations could have changed and circumstances certainly have. From the applicant side, again, number one is that regulations often do and will change, and so they're dealing with a different regulatory environment, which may leave them at a very much a disadvantage for the project as proposed. Another aspect is that circumstances do change. We have seen applicants who have every intention of proceeding with their project until they get the contractor's bid. and then either the project goes away, never to be seen again, except under our current regulations, it's still, the approvals still remain valid, or that you end up with a substantially different project when it's ultimately built. So all of these factors add into the recommendation from staff as previously endorsed by your commission and the council, which is to provide a reasonable time limit on how long an application, both an application can remain incomplete and how long approvals of various types can remain valid. It is noted that in our town codes right now, we have an inconsistency in terms of application approvals, where 2 of the approvals, and Linda could
HRD and variance
expire, but the remainder, for example, design review don't. So we have this very awkward situation where if somebody were applying for, say, design review and a variance, you would have part of the approvals expire and the other one arguably not. It sounds like a pretty good setup for a lawsuit and lots of hurt feelings along the way. So another attempt or another goal behind this regulation, and something which, as proposed, it will achieve, is to sync up all of our regulations. One of the other aspects that we get in terms of discretionary permit time limits is that the state, with respect to subdivision applications, has extended almost indefinitely approvals of prior subdivisions. And so the regulations that you have before you allows that were there to be some portion of that project which is currently valid, i.e. it hasn't termed out, that the remainder of those approvals would remain valid. This is especially important and applicable in dealing with a subdivision, because if you don't retain the discretionary applications with all of the conditions of approval that accompany such an application, you could end up in a situation where the division of land is applicable, but you lose all of the conditions which craft the project into something that was approvable and is acceptable to the town. So the idea is if something remains valid, it would continue to remain valid. Now, it's noted, and I did get an email from one of the commissioners, that there are situations when certain project submittal elements take a long time to provide. And I am personally familiar with a situation where technical information can be a long time in coming, and longer than the recommended 90 days. There's 2 elements of what we're proposing here. The first is that recognizing that things like recorded surveys or soils reports, structural information, et cetera, can often take a lengthy amount of time to provide. We're proposing to clarify in our applications exactly what people will typically be required to submit when they submit an application. And that way they know going in, they have a pretty good idea, for example, that if you're on a steep slope and you have to get an HRD application, you will probably be required to get some soils information and likely a drainage plan as well. If, despite an applicant's best efforts, there are incompletion items that an applicant cannot provide in a timely manner, i.e. in the 90 days to which we are currently proposing, the planning director has the discretion to grant an extension. And when it comes to technical information, we would have no problem in approving such a request. An applicant simply has to notify us of that request. We feel that 3 months is a reasonable time period to establish in this ordinance for extensions on incomplete applications, or excuse me, not extensions, but for valid time periods on incomplete applications. Because if we're not dealing with those type of technical documents that can often take a considerable amount of time to provide, we believe that 3 months is enough time for an applicant and his design team to respond to whatever the incompletion items are. Typically, it's things like show us the setback, provide us with coverage calculations, the type of thing that more experienced applicants, certainly architects who are familiar with doing business locally and in Marin in general, usually get most of the time. But part of what happens is every jurisdiction has its own little requirements, and Fairfax is no exception. So that 90 days would provide an ample period of time, we believe, for an applicant and her architect, designer, et cetera, to respond to those incompletion items. If not, again, as noted, they simply have to request an extension. If there is an adequate reason, we would certainly be granting it. Similarly, for project approvals, and we can use the example of the Great Recession of 08, 09, of course, dragging out for many people subsequent to that, where people would have entitlements and all of a sudden people were losing jobs, barely hanging on to their mortgages, et cetera, et cetera. And it's understandable that if we experience a severe economic downturn, or if there are some other circumstances where, for reasons beyond the applicant's control, they are unable to vest those entitlements via a building permit, we would certainly take those factors under advisement. And I can say that if it is a major recession or something like that, more than likely we would be granting extensions to that. So given those allowances for reasonable variation in what people can provide in a timely manner, staff recommends the proposed ordinance. What we're trying to do is, rather than list time limits in every chapter, we could see with the current ordinance that they didn't catch every type of application. We've simply made a reference to the time limits at the end of every chapter and contained it in one section. So when you're writing a incompletion letter and warning applicants of the timelines that are involved, it's a much neater letter to say that you, pursuant to section blah, 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 you need to be aware that you need to respond within 90 days or your application could be deemed expired, rather than simply saying pursuant to this section for this, for example, use permit, in this section for the variance, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is a little bit more streamlined and elegant way to include that requirement and bring that to people's attention. We would certainly include a warning prior to expiring any application or entitlement. We would make those warnings in writing. I would calculate that we would provide an advisory letter saying that your time is due to expire. For example, in the case of an incomplete application, we might write that 1 month or 2 weeks prior to the expiration. And again, this is to prompt people. It's not necessarily that, oh, if you don't have all your information, your application is deemed expired, but tell us why it's taking you longer than we normally see to either complete an application, or in the case of an entitlement, where we would certainly provide a month's notice to tell us why you're not proceeding on to a building permit. So those are the type of, it doesn't show up in the ordinance because ordinances tend to be kind of etched in stone, and we would like to have procedures to be a little bit more fluid. There might be different ways that we would be notifying applicants in the future that we wouldn't want to try to capture on an ordinance. So that's simply with a procedural thing, but I can tell you that should this ordinance pass, we will be modifying our project status letters to reflect this type of warning period that we would be providing applicants. It was brought to our attention by a very good proofreader on the commission that there were a number of minor omissions or errors included, specifically in the title. And the ones that are most substantive are the resolution. And what you can see in what we just handed you, which has the red strikeouts, is that what we're trying to do here is to reflect the title of the section in the particular section precisely. So what we're substituting is striking out and including a semicolon. In the case of the ordinance, of course, this is simply a draft ordinance that would go to the town council, and it would be their ordinance. It's more to give the planning commission an opportunity to see the type of whereases and findings and things like that, and then how we would construct the actual ordinance. And so what we have provided for is, again, a accurate description of the zone changes being proposed in the title. And then I think that's it. The last change that you have before you is simply syncing up the title to make it accurately reflect exactly what the name of the proposed zoning sections are. And then we finally provided the ordinance itself. We also have a red line version where you can kind of see what has been changed from the original language. Everything that's in a color is brand new, and something that is in black and white or is struck out is something that's existing and either unchanged or being proposed to be struck out. And let's see, I think there's one other thing. Oh, I should probably just stop talking and let your commission comment. So if you have any questions, feel free.
Any questions for staff on my left?
Since I just was able to read the proposed code section, Ben, could you clarify what the process is that if you, after you have been granted a planning permit, what the process is for an extension? I was a little unclear, and I thought it might be good to have that explained a little more.
Sure. What happens when you have an incomplete?
Not so much on an incomplete one that has
complete,
been
vested.
Yes.
You have your entitlements, and now it's time.
But due to, a number of circumstances, you weren't able to apply for your building permit in order to enact on the permit, but would like to keep it,
Yes.
so that you could perhaps still do it within another, within the next year.
Sure. So what we've done is under 17040110 permit time limits and extensions, under B, extensions of time, what it says is the applicant shall file a written request. So that's one thing we ask, is that they write us a letter or send us an email and set forth and do so prior to the expiration. As stated, we will be providing applicants with written notice that their application is due to expire and that it will expire unless they provide us with a written request for an extension. So they'll get the notice. They need to give us a request in writing. The planning director will review that request and determine if the permit holder has attempted to comply with the conditions of the permit. And there's been a few situations where people come up with some pretty creative reasons. For a while they were citing the fires, and some of the rationales were fairly dodgy. But in any event, we would look that over, and if it was deemed that they had made a good faith effort to meet the time limits but were unable to do so for good and sufficient reasons, then we would grant the extension. And I think that extension is up to a year. Is that correct, Linda?
Yes.
Yes. So, and
What I was unclear about was if they had to go back to the commission in order to renew that to be granted that extension.
no, what we're saying here is in a situation where perhaps the regulations haven't changed, but our policies have shifted. Maybe we've written a new general plan or done a general plan amendment that discourages that type of application. They may be within the time period, but it may be a situation that involves a policy issue. And in that situation, staff, as proposed in the code, could remand the item to the Planning Commission for their determination of whether or not they wish to grant an extension.
Okay, thanks, because I just wanted clarification on that, so I think you answered my question.
Hester?
Yeah, I have a question about, where did it go? Incomplete discretionary permit application. So basically I think this says that once you deem an application incomplete, people have 30 days I guess, to submit the missing items or to complete the application. Is that correct?
Is it 30 or is it 90?
So I'm looking at number 2. I'm looking at section 17.040.100.
Yes.
Incomplete, number 2. So it says, an incomplete discretionary permit application submitted to resolve a code enforcement matter shall expire 30 days following the date the
Right.
agency provides written notice. So I'm
Yeah,
just.
thank you for bringing that to my attention. The violation situation, we feel as though the extended timelines for those should be shorter. And the idea is because, in essence, we're giving people an opportunity to resolve a violation by submitting an application. And a lot of times there's some foot dragging and unwillingness to do so. The application aspect is really more of a procedural element that people can pursue in lieu of abatement. And so what this is saying is, look, if you're going to pursue the application to get a retroactive approval, you need to do so in a timely manner and not waste everybody's time. If not, there are often other circumstances that accompany violations. So, for example, they may not be able to get approval without a variance. That may have entered into their calculations why they did the unpermitted work in the first place. So the idea is we're going to let them know if their application is incomplete and they need to respond in a timely manner. And if they fail to do so, then we're off to the enforcement stage.
Okay, so for general time limits, it's 90 days. So, okay, an application gets deemed incomplete, they have 90 days to provide all the documents for completion. So for enforcement cases, you're putting more eyes on it, a little bit more urgency. So let me just ask a question. I guess it's at your discretion to extend that, say, it's a pretty big correction. It might take more than 30 days to complete it. So that would be at your discretion.
Yeah, it's a situation where, again, if there are technical documents and they've got the name of the surveyor or the geotech or something like that, so we can tell that they're actually working with those people, we might call them up, in fact, and just say, hey, is it true that you're unable to provide this information in a timely manner? So just to confirm that, if they're stuck like regular applicants are, we would likely grant an extension. But if they're foot dragging, if what they submit as an application is, kind of a back of the napkin type of drawings, which we have seen on occasion, that's the time to just say, look, you either get serious or we'll just deal with this as a pure enforcement matter.
Okay. Just a question, or just food for thought. I know some towns will reset the clock every time you submit something. So something gets deemed incomplete, and then they complete the application, and the clock resets, and they have another 90 days. And so sometimes that occurs during construction. Every time there's an inspection, the clock resets. I guess the intent is to not so much to say, okay, your time's up, clock's, ticking, but to show progress that somebody is really pursuing the project. But it gives people a little bit more flexibility or time.
Yeah, what we're really looking to do is to ensure that projects that have functionally been abandoned or have applicants that are simply unwilling to respond in any kind of comprehensive manner to the incompletion items don't end up stuck in our system indefinitely. And we have some circumstances like that where they'll resubmit, for example, and they'll change one thing, or they don't change anything at all. And not to besmirch designers, but sometimes we feel as though they're overextended and they just want to get something in so they can turn to their clients and say, well, we submitted, we don't know what the problem is with them. So it's those type of circumstances. We really want to make sure that, how are you responding? But the mere fact that they're not abandoning the project, that's our main problem. Is we've got projects that are stale for years. And right now they sit in a more or less, what has to be legally considered an active situation because we can't have them expire. So, yeah, whether or not it's an enforcement or a regular application, if we're seeing that steady progress towards completion, we'll probably give them the benefit of the doubt.
So it's at your discretion.
It is at our discretion, and when they do resubmit, it does reset the clock in terms of, we have to give them, for example, we have to give them a letter within 30 days to say it's incomplete or it's deemed complete. So that's one of the things where the onus is on us too, which is another challenge. If you have something that's years old and here comes in something where we have to say, oh gosh, what's changed, what's current, what do the regulations now say? We have to get them that letter and say, okay, this is what the current regulations are and what you need to do, and maybe it's complete, in which case we let them know. But if we don't, then 30 days later, they've got a complete application.
Okay, thank you.
Questions on my right for staff? Phil?
Yeah, one, under permit time limits and extensions, 17040-110, there's a lot of the word vesting, and what I can't quite figure out is what vesting means. It seems to need a definition, and there's another, so the question really is, at this point, not comments, but questions, is what do you mean by vesting?
That's a tricky term of art. I will do my best. I'm sure a land use attorney could probably do a better job, but as it's commonly known within the context of planning and building applications, what it means is that, for example, when your commission approves a project, there's an appeal period. And once that appeal period has expired, then that application is considered vested. In other words, with your typical design review or something like that, that person can turn around and sell those entitlements. And legally, anybody who wishes to prevent that project at that point is enjoined from doing so. So they are vested during the time period that approval remains valid. That would also apply to a building permit. There's various vesting periods for that, and sometimes it depends on the amount of work that an applicant has done, whether it's considered vested no matter what. But the idea is it's an entitlement, and it's beyond legal challenge at that point. And partly this is to provide due process to say, speak or hold your peace. This is one of the key purposes that we achieve with public hearings, where we provide notice to neighbors and other potentially concerned parties, and they can stand up and say, this is our concern. Your commission, regularly modifies projects in response to those concerns. Once all those comments have been received, once the commission's review and comments and direction on conditions of approval have been incorporated into the project and the decision has been rendered, there's a very brief time period within which somebody can challenge that. And then once that's lapsed, that approval is locked in.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to have a comment on that later.
Can I just ask a question on the vesting that discussion brought up in my mind? And you brought it up with the example that we've had an application come before the Planning Commission that received and approved permits. We approved the application. That parcel is now up for sale. That parcel is up for sale and is for sale with an approved set of plans, okay? So when you look at permit time limits and extensions, as it's written here, time limits vesting unless conditions of approval or other applicable law establish different time. The permit shall not be deemed vested until, at a minimum, the permit holder has actually obtained a building permit or other construction permit and has made substantial progress toward completing the improvements in accordance with the approved permits, or has actually commenced the allowed use on the property. So I guess the question pops up in my mind now, if that property owner has an approved permit, that permit with that property owner isn't vested until, the way this is written, the way I understand it, until a building permit is issued or depending on what it is, there's progress made on that. So he sells the property with that approved permitting. Then what this reads to me is that the new owner doesn't have a vested, that permit isn't vested.
Well, there's two elements of that, and again, I probably should have dragged an attorney in to help, but there's the entitlements which you receive and the appeal period once an appeal period is lapsed. So as you point out, and we're not looking at any particular property, but somebody gets an approval, that's something that they can sell, and that's usually of considerable value, especially in Marin. So for what's interesting is right now, at least one of the approvals doesn't have a time limit. Were these amendments to pass, those would take effect. So they would be subject to that time limit. In terms of as it reads literally within this ordinance, yes, they would have to, in order to build the project to completion no matter what, they would have to obtain a building permit and start building. And this is something that Commissioner Gonzalez-Parber pointed out, is that it might be a slow construction process where they pull their building permit and then 6 months later they get their foundation pour inspection, and then 6 months after that they get their framing inspection, and it could drag out. But the idea is that they need to make some sort of progress towards completion of the project in order for it to be considered and to remain vested.
So it sounds like if the situation I brought up were to occur after this went into effect, then that what they received, the prior owner received from us wouldn't apply if it was after a year?
Right, we would notify whoever the owner was, and that would be a project. Any project that we've approved that has not yet received a building permit and which is not yet under construction, we would notify that person prior to the expiration of their approval that they need to take steps to obtain their building permit in order to be vested.
And that's already on the books now. If they don't, they have, their HRD is good for a year. If they aren't going to be able to build in that year, they have to in writing request an extension from the planning director. If the project hasn't changed, he can grant a 1-year extension. If they sell it to somebody else, that time limit is still ticking, right? So if 2 years pass and nobody's pulled a building permit, they lose their HRD. That's the way it's written now. And all we're doing is trying to add the use permit so that the use permits expire. Variances already do, they have that same language, and then we want our ridgeline permits to expire in the same fashion.
And design review
And
applications.
design
So
review,
all of our
right.
discretionary applications.
So some of them are already running under that limit right now.
Sorry, no.
And that vesting.
Yeah, for the HRD,
I don't recall
believe-
seeing it, but I went
Yeah.
through it today, but
We'll clarify
Right.
that.
Michelle?
Thank you. And I think my first question was actually along this same thread, and it was more like if the applicant has a tentative map and is required to get a variance and a conditional use permit all at the same time, and maybe there's a hillside one on top of it, and then you look at this, does that mean that once they pull their final map, then all of their other approvals are final or vested? Or do they run with, so the parcel map has one, and then you have the But then you might have conditions of approval on some of those, so I'm not sure what triggers what or how in that, when you have a bunch of things all together.
Yeah, the good thing about what we're proposing here is, let's just say there's a hypothetical subdivision application. It involves several discretionary applications with it. It receives its approvals. Right now, if some of those don't have time limits, it would be a pretty interesting question about which ones expire, or even more worryingly, what if some of the discretionary application approvals did have time limits? Because what we have seen is the state legislature, and I've researched this, there's probably 5 or 6 laws signed into, codified in the California Code that affect subdivision applications, whether they're preliminary maps or typically final maps, different ways. But the effect in some instances has been to extend the approval of those 20 years or more. So what we have now is kind of a mishmash of whether or not those discretionary entitlements expire, how long those discretionary entitlements are valid for. The state has made it very clear that subdivision, once it, and some of it, I believe, does apply to the preliminary map, so they're not even at the final map submittal stage. Those extend out years, in some case decades. And so when you have conditions of approval that are pretty clearly only applicable to the other discretionary approvals, for example, design review, we're looking at the design of the house, and there's a bunch of conditions there. You have to have green roof or something like that. That's not going to attach to the subdivision map. So if the discretionary entitlements expire, the subdivision may be arguably still valid while the conditions of approval and the discretionary entitlements no longer are. You would have the lots, you wouldn't necessarily have the houses approved along with it, but you would still have the subdivision, and you've lost the benefit of that extensive review that was conducted that led to, in this case, an affirmative decision, an approval. So what we're doing here is syncing everything up together. So it says, hey, state, you can pass your varying laws that do varying things. And at the county, when I was working there, I probably had 2 or 3 applications where I would spend days looking at how all the various Senate bills and things that were now part of state law affected approval, and realizing, wow, this one adds 5 years, this one adds 7 years, and this applies to this portion of the approval, and you end up with a 20-year extension. And frankly, we took provisions from the county code because the county adopted these time limits and this syncing that you're referring to directly to address that specific problem. So it's just learning from the experience of other jurisdictions, in this case the county, and saying, if you've got an entitlement that has some kind of extended time limits, notwithstanding everything else, all those other entitlements, their approvals extend out to the same length of time, and that way we preserve the conditions of approval. Hopefully that explained it.
My next question is on page 2, item 4, and it's about the planning director finds that a significant policy question is at issue, and the planning director may refer the application back to the planning commission or public hearing. And so then does that mean the expiration is stayed then in that circumstance? So the dates don't keep running?
Right. We would,
Okay.
yeah. If there were a time period for the consideration, we would consider it stayed until that decision was rendered by the planning commission.
And so in item 3 above, the circumstances that you're referring to is something significant like a general plan policy change or an ordinance change?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Whatever we may be in disagreement with an applicant, that's another aspect.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions, Michelle?
No, thank you.
Okay, I've got a bunch as usual. Phil, do you have more? Or do you want to?
Well, I don't know if they're questions or comments, so I'm not sure what period of this hearing we're in.
Okay, let's go for questions first.
Why Well, I have comments.
Okay, let me go with mine then. Okay. Can you explain how, since some of this kind of relates to or makes a connection to building permits, can you explain how building permits work? How long are they good or valid? Do they expire? Are they extended? If they're extended, is there a fee required? That's my first question.
You know what? I don't know. I can find out, but the challenge is, well, here's the challenge is that we're not considering building permits tonight. It's something that we may look into in a future round of consideration for the building code. But in terms of, we can say that somebody has to apply for a building permit and that there's, I think it's 6 months between inspections, called inspections. That's kind of the term that we typically see, is that you have to call for your inspections no greater than 6 months apart.
Okay, and I wasn't looking at this from addressing any changes to building permits. But since we do in here kind of relate building permits to discretionary permits, I wanted to understand how we work building permits, so that gives me a better understanding of the connection between the two. So maybe that can be a question answered later. My next question. Discretionary approvals. So when I went through the code, we have things like sign permits, discretionary. We have traffic impact permits. And we also have a section 17024, required permits, which addresses zoning permits. None of those sections were amended or changed to reflect this type of process. And the sign permits have different timeframes. So I think sign permits are good for 6 months unless you act on them. So I guess when we say we're addressing everything, did we look at those to include those in this process?
Well, I think what we were doing with the sign permits and the TIPs, and I forget the third one you mentioned.
17024, required permits, which discusses zoning permits.
Okay, so that's more of a general item. But in terms of sign permits, if you don't have the business, that would probably be.
I think the required permits also has a time frame in there. Not that I have it in front of me, but anyway, go ahead.
We'll take a look at that, but the sign is going to be accessory to other permits. So for example, a use permit for a business. If that use permit isn't vested, they're not going to come in for their sign subsequent to that. So I think that the feeling was, let's focus on the major applications that your commission typically sees. In some instances, the sign permit doesn't even require going to the commission. In terms of traffic impact permits, we're looking at amending that provision, those provisions more extensively. So we would probably take another look at that time frame. Frankly, traffic analyses are their own little universe in terms of how long an assessment is valid for. We're going to be running into vehicle miles traveled versus level of service pretty soon. So that, again, that's a separate item. And then in terms of 1724, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That strikes me as something that's.
I don't even know what that is, and we've never processed one.
Yeah.
So that's worth looking at, I guess, is where I'm going.
That's a good one.
I'm going with this. If we're trying to address all of these with these changes,
Yeah.
we should look at those.
Yeah, we might want to eliminate that section entirely when we dive into that, but thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Let's see.
Yeah.
So in the staff report, it talks about deem a project's plan approval to have expired if a given period of time has elapsed without the applicant obtaining construction permits and proceeding with construction to completion in a timely manner. And I'm assuming that's referring to 17040-110 Paren A, permit time limits and extensions, the vesting chapter section. The permit shall not be deemed vested until, at a minimum, the permit holder has actually obtained a building permit or other construction permit and has made substantial progress toward completing the improvements in accordance with the approved permits, or has actually commenced or allowed use on the subject property in compliance with the conditions of approval, blah, blah, blah. So what do we consider substantial progress toward completing improvements?
That's another one of those tricky questions.
These go to the heart of my comments coming up here, too.
Right. Well,
we have historically done in Fairfax with building permits? So in Fairfax, we have a lot of homeowners that do their own projects, and so our building department, if you call for an inspection every 6 months, right, and you show, like, you can't call for one nail and do one nail 6 months later, but if you do your foundation and 6 months later you call for some framing, you know, and you show that every 6 months you keep your building permit active, if you don't call for an inspection for 6 months, your building permit lapses, and you have to resubmit your building permit and pay new fees to reactivate it.
And that's in part my questions to try and understand this is, how do we address building permits? Because I, too, was thinking of homeowners, there's less of them now than there used to be,
Right.
but we still have homeowners who do their own remodeling or building, you know, where they're doing it on the weekends or at nights. And I don't want to do anything that adversely affects that category.
Well, you wouldn't be because it's governed by the
Residents.
building code.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So that's why I needed kind of the information on the building side, since we're touching upon that with this. So we asked a question on enforcement cases, and that's an extension of 90 days. What happens, right? I think it's 30 days, and then you get an extension of 90 days. So what happens if your enforcement issue is substantial, where 90 days may not be enough?
Well, I think it depends on how you characterize substantial. I know that one situation, which we won't refer to directly tonight, but we're fully intending to proceed towards summary abatement because it's an outstanding problem that hasn't been resolved over an extended period of time. So in that circumstance, it's not a question of, oh, let's go back, before, resubmit an application. It's you need to do something or we're basically going to take over your project and your property and abate the violations that represent a safety hazard. So those ones have different circumstances. Yeah, maybe it takes longer if somebody's got a whole bunch of tricky technical information that they have to submit. But again, there's one element of sometimes people just bootleg stuff in because they're pretty sure they'd never get approved.
Right, and I understand that. And I guess what I was looking at are maybe the in the middle person who has an issue, is taking care of it, but the issue is substantial. And what happens if what they need to do takes longer than that 90 days extension? Then there's no recourse here. I'm just, thinking out loud here, there's no recourse here to go beyond a one-time 90-day extension. The way it's written here, correct?
Yes.
All right.
They could potentially request a policy review by your planning commission, for example, to stay the time periods. There's various ways I think that if somebody were actually saying, look, we don't know where the property line is, and it's going to take us a long time. And we know that sometimes surveys take 6 months to get recorded. That's what we're asking for. So something like that where they've got the surveyor hired, we contact the surveyor, yeah, I'm backed up, it's this, it's that. Those type of things, substantial progress.
When we have other extension requests come in, do all of those require a fee?
Right now, they don't require a fee.
So if I'm coming in for an extension, let's say on my building permit, would that require a fee?
That's different.
Okay.
Planning permits. we
But no
don't-
planning permits
No.
if we ask for extensions, and some of these, I think, already have.
That doesn't mean we won't adopt a fee.
Right.
Extending things.
Because everything you're saying in here says you will have a fee for an extension request,
I didn't catch that part. Is that
I believe.
Yeah. So we're in the process of updating our fees, right? And I think we did include an extension fee in our new fee schedule, did we not? So that is going to be in place. So that's good that that language is in there. Right now, we don't charge a fee because it's just a letter and the planning director issuing a letter saying it's been extended, right? But there needs to be a fee.
Another question, most of the language it will either delete out existing language and refers for permit time limits and extensions to the 17040110. But in reading through these code sections, all of these code sections also have a paragraph that talks about what an application is. Okay? So, for example, 17028 says, describes the application process and when the Planning Commission has to act on the application, such as within 45 days of when the application is filed. Okay? So, in the section, we don't reference at all in here 17040-100, which describes what an application is. And I see confusion there if somebody is looking at one of these chapters. 17028 is variances, okay? So if they're looking at coming in for a variance and it says, okay, my application, when I file my application, then I have a hearing 45 days after, it doesn't speak to what's considered officially filed. And I see that because we're nowhere in those chapters are we referencing 040-100, which talks about complete versus incomplete applications. And I think they should marry up. So if I'm looking at variances, I want to understand when my application is considered complete and filed so that I know when the hearing is and not just reference permit time limits and extensions. I found that confusing.
Yeah, that's one of the elements of our code. We certainly saw when we were looking at maximum house sizes and what constitutes a quorum for recommendations and what happens if the commission does or doesn't take action, whether that's a failure to recommend or it goes forward. There are some provisions of our current code that are very confusing. And so bit by bit, I think we will adjust those to make it clear what's intended. I mean, that's a good observation. It's a little bit beyond the scope of what we consider a pretty minor housekeeping cleanup here. Certainly an applicant who has an incomplete application will have a punch list in that project status letter. It'll be like, you need to do this, this, this. It's very prescriptive. If they have any questions, they contact the staff planner and the planner tells them what it is. So in those situations, I think we pretty much resolve what they need to do to get a complete application, and it's ministerial. So that aspect is probably not too complicated or problematic. When we're looking at the question of, a completed application, it's a good point. We can dive into that, and probably we would pull that information out of those respective chapters because frankly, that's more of a procedure form where we say, this is what you need to do for different types of applications.
And I'll save some of my thoughts on that for the discussion. The last one was we're looking to amend the Hill Area Residential Development section, and we had already come up at a prior meeting with some language in that one that was confusing. So I think it was saying projects requiring a Hill Area Residential Development permit shall be reviewed by the Planning Commission prior to being referred. So I guess when you're doing this, the process you've done so far, you're not looking at the totality of the section to clean up anything else like that within that section now that you have that opportunity and you're looking at that, correct?
Yeah, our concern is that simply it's a longer term and larger scope process to take out the inconsistencies, areas that are confusing, things that are, there's certain things that just don't exist in any code I've ever worked with. And there may be good and sufficient reasons why Fairfax has that and why they should continue to have that. But this code is replete with those type of things. So it's not just, it's almost like grabbing a thread and starting to pull it. And the next thing you know, your sweater turns into a ball of yarn. The idea is to just say, this one is fairly straightforward. We're simply saying that these, they need to expire, and we have a number of them, and it's probably a safety hazard. I shouldn't say that. I'm just kidding, Cal OSHA, but that our filing system is pretty seriously overloaded. So to the extent that we can take those applications and get them done, that will enable us to focus on current applications and not worry about these older ones.
Okay, I'm going to, if everyone's asked their questions, I'm going to open this up for public comment. Does anyone have public comment on this item?
Hello. First, I'd like to thank the director for all the clarifications based on the packet as it was downloaded. It was not a complete packet. Essentially, what I have to say initially is I watched the public notices for hearings pretty closely at the bulletin board, and I do not think that this hearing was properly noticed. The notice for 402 Scenic was posted timely. The notice for this was added afterwards. It did not show up until the agenda. And I think the fact that the room is full of people who are speaking on this important matter speaks for that. I think this is an important matter which could cost some people a lot of money, having their permits expired and needing to pay application fees over again. So I don't think this is ready to do anything except be continued to another meeting with the proper notices. I do believe that the Planning Commission has the body of expertise versus the Town Council to discuss this at great length. And at the time that they turn over the draft ordinance to the Town Council, it should be in a more refined format than it is right now. There are a number of things that I see here which I could probably be best writing, but one of the comments I've been hearing is the topic of accrual. I mean, okay, if a permit is is if an application is deemed incomplete and you have 30 days if it's a violation, which I don't think is enough, or 90 days, and then someone responds, which means it's not stale because there's a response, which is if what we're trying to accomplish here is to eliminate stale applications, which should be pretty obvious if they're stale. If there's a conversation or a dialogue, they're not stale. And if it is true that the accrual time clock resets at the time that there's a correspondence, then it should be in the language of the ordinance, and I don't believe it is in there clearly. I heard some discussion already that it does not appear to be in there, and I think that when this is refined for the next hearing, that should be present in there. I'll just go back to I do believe the time limits are too short. I do believe they're inconsistent with other time limits. For example, a conditional use permit has a 6-month. If you do not act on the conditional use permit in 6 months, you lose it. So I think the 30 days and the 90 days are inconsistent with that. So I think there should be some uniformity across different types of discretionary permits, which need to be reviewed and of course do that. My notes are a little bit scattered here. However, I do think that based on the substantial costs to reapply for some of these permits, these zoning permits, they can be thousands of dollars. I do think that we need to give people a chance. Sometimes people get old, sometimes they have estate issues, health issues, they're out of the country. And I mean, we can go through a whole bunch of reasons. I'm sure the planning department's heard lots of them. Some of them are valid, but it seems like a lot of extra work to make all these exceptions. If the mission is to get rid of the stale permits and to make fewer exceptions that need a whole lot of correspondence in order to exercise the discretion of, yes, we've decided to give you another 30 days or another 90 days. That sounds like a lot more paperwork too. So I'm just a little bit concerned for that as well. Again, I think the essence here is let's make sure that the people who have something skin in this game, I don't personally, I'm just here because I noticed it and I go, wow. In other jurisdictions, this would have meant a lot to me, especially where I've done projects out of state, where I couldn't get to the meetings without making major efforts and without financial setups to make that happen. So I just ask that the Planning Commission, again, continue the debate, continue the hearings into another meeting. Hopefully there'll be a better public response. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to close public comment and bring it back to the commission for discussion.
Yeah, I have some really big issues with 17040-110A. So if vesting is, of course, the approval of something and the appeal period is expired, it's vested. That's sort of generally true. Then that's not the definition provided in A, time limits, which is something completely different. Also, the use of the word deemed vested in the middle of that paragraph is an issue for me because maybe we could say considered vested instead, because deemed kind of means like there's no conditions, just time has passed and therefore, we haven't heard back from you, therefore it's deemed vested. And that could be confused and vague in, some future interpretation of this language. And I agree with Cindy that the substantial progress language is pretty vague. That needs to be a little more fleshed out. Maybe something like a first inspection has taken place and or passed, maybe too stringent to say that, but something like that, some kind of active, time-certain event that happens, and maybe even vested shouldn't even be the word to be used there, because vested is something it already is. If they have a permit, and the appeal period is passed, then it's vested. So this is sort of like what you do to keep your permit going, rather than it already is vested. So I have a problem with that whole paragraph because of that. I just want to make that comment and hopefully think it through a little bit and get rid of the vagueness to come up with some events that are more solid, certain things that people will have. I mean, you talk about notice and opportunity to respond to these things. I don't think an applicant necessarily reading this, or an architect even, would know what that vesting there means. If they have the permit and the appeal period is passed, it's vested. So this is a little confusing this way.
Any other comments?
Yes, I have a comment. Actually, it goes back to the comment by, is it Mr. Hamer? I think that's I guess, a very good point to address, maybe not to resolve right now, but it sounds like the way we're talking about this seems like as soon as this is codified, all these permits that have been there forever go out the window. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe it sounds like there will be a protocol that is, I don't know if that needs to be discussed with us, just in terms of a protocol that you guys will have to notify everybody, say, hey, by the way, your permit is, here, the clock starts today. So it seems like something has to happen that is not so absolute for those permits that have been on file for years, because I do agree, in some cases, we're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars, not just in the application fees, but in the designer's fees, the design professional fees. So it seems that, if it's something we don't address here, that it definitely should be considered in terms of notifying people, a protocol to notify people that their permits are going to expire.
We could at the beginning, once these provisions have been adopted, if they're adopted, we could alert people to say that, by the way, pursuant to these sections, your application will expire in 1 year, unless you vest it. However, we clarify that term and make substantial progress. Our feeling is a lot of these applications, it's not going to matter. There's a reason why they've been sitting on a shelf for a decade, and that's not going to change. The only thing that'll happen is we get to say, you can pick up your information or we'll recycle it. But sure, we can try to make sure that these people are given as much advance notice as possible to say, time to exercise that approval or it's going to go away.
Right. I mean, it might also be a protection for the town to notify people in case somebody does come back a year later and says, hey, you guys didn't even notify me, and, they might come back with a lawsuit. But if you notify them once, twice, 3 times, and you still get no response, then you're covered, whatever that number is. So apparently Linda has experience with this, so. Yeah, right.
Yeah, the reality is
One notification would be, a
Right,
registered
right,
certified mail that we're,
Right. Yeah, I'm not saying that there should be 3. I'm just saying that there should be some legal documentation that you try to reach them to protect the town.
Yeah, it's not our intention to blindside anyone. The idea is simply to get it done or recognize that it's not going to get done unless they want to come back with a fresh application. That's the other aspect is, one of the conversations we had is, oh, gee, under these circumstances, can people reapply? Sure. So that they can say, oh, okay, now I finally, got the missing document and now I'm ready to reapply.
there may be, maybe they can't get the right signature. I've seen that many times in my career where there's a party that has to sign off and, we're saying, hey, we've got 3 property owners and 2 signatures, and it takes them years. That's a situation where they really should go away until or unless they get that signature. And then when they come back, they're ready to proceed forward rather than, again, having these kind of stalled applications.
And can I ask you a question, Ben? Because I have applications that are literally 11 years old. I think they predate the WUI zone. So am I supposed to, I've given them an incomplete letter. They show up with 11-year-old information of what's missing. In reality, I should be routing that application again, but I don't know, do I legally have the right to say that? I've told them you're missing only this information. It's 11 years old, right?
Not something to
It's
debate
not a
at a
good
public
situation to be
hearing
in.
tonight.
Right?
But it
Right.
is, that's
But that's
yet
the
another
problem.
example of why,
That's the problem.
yeah, you have this old application and there's a whole bunch of things that could and should apply and maybe do, but how do you roll that into a project status letter today?
Right, I think it's, that's a point well taken. I think it's just important for the public to know that they're not going to be wiped out as soon as this is codified, because I think that's maybe a question, that will be asked.
Laura?
Yes, I mean, as a design professional, I have concerns about 90 days is too short. And I'd like to see the time frame more like 180 days. Sometimes we've got to do, design changes to respond to fire department comments, other things that could be pretty costly. So right now, that's, I agree there should be a time limit on planning permits. I think most other cities in Marin already have that, so I think it creates a consistency. And I agree that code enforcement cases should have a shorter time to resubmit. But in general, I don't support the 90 days.
Michelle?
Okay. On 17.04.100A, on the first sentence where it says review of completeness, and then on the third line it says before it is accepted and acknowledges being complete, I think there should be a period there. It shouldn't go on and officially filed, because I think the application is filed once it's filed. This is a determination of completeness, is the way I was interpreting this first sentence. So I would put a period there. I like what we've been talking about with the resetting. And I'm kind of back to, well, let me just go back down to, under that same section, item C. After a discretionary permit application has been determined to be complete, the town may require the applicant to submit additional information necessary to conduct environmental review. I think there should be a period there. In other words, before an application is even filed, the city should have a checklist about what are the minimum requirements for submittal. Any additional information at that point. I see. This is, or additional information that they missed from that checklist? Or what is that? Or otherwise evaluate the application's consistency. So that would be something unique to the site.
Yeah, what happens, well, the CEQA is obviously, that we can say an application is complete. We have one right now that for the merits review, we have enough information, but obviously the CEQA aspect, when we're doing the EIR, there's going to be a lot more information, some of which is likely to be required from the applicant. So that's the obvious, if we're going to do California Environmental Quality Act review, there's going to be more information and you're going to have to provide it, even if we say your project's complete. In terms of the other thing, what happens is there are circumstances where we don't have enough information to evaluate the project in full. And so what we say is, okay, give us this, this is the initial stuff. And then once they submit that, we're like, oh, okay, you're over height. So now you need to apply for a variance. We didn't know they needed a variance because we didn't have a height called out. So I think those are the type of things where we may not be able to catch everything we try to. That's, a course of professionalism is you don't keep adding on requirements, but there are some circumstances where incomplete items prevent you from saying, the example I just cited, where they don't call out the height and you don't know whether it requires a variance for being over height. They provide the information, you go, oh, now you need to apply for a variance. You didn't tell them that in your first letter, but they still have to do it, and it's after the initial 30 days.
All right, thank you. On 17.040100A, under substantial progress, I was going to recommend ongoing and continual, but I'm in support of whatever you come up with that we can look at that point. I also think this section, just if combined, I don't know if we need subsections here where it's A, 1, 2, 3, or some language if combined. How are you going to, determine vesting? And I wrote down definition as well, so that's good. Under the next page, page 2, item 2, I was trying to think about where this says with conditions of approval, whether every discretionary permit would have conditions of approval, whether that's the right language or not. I guess I don't need to decide it right now, but I was kind of thinking, could there be a discretionary? No, I guess not. Could you get an approval without conditions? I don't know. I don't know if that word is right. And it's repeated on item 3, conditions in a timely fashion. And also in 3, just circumstances. I wonder if circumstances should be defined better. And then item 4, and the expiration is stayed. I think that there should be a section here about you taking the next action after you expire it to refund unused fees. And I'm in support of including fees in this in the fee schedule that's coming through, so you get adopted fees for your work that you're doing. I do think that we should think about I don't know how many people are currently in the queue of possibly getting expired, but I almost think we should be notifying them of this process. How many people are there? Linda? Okay. I think you should think about that. And then immediately after, follow up, because I think we do want to clear it out. But I thought you guys did a great job. I'm really glad we're going forward with this. Thank you.
Did you already do yours?
I did. I just want to
Okay.
get clarification on that one point, but I'm glad we're doing this too. And it's good. We need to move forward with it, and you need to clear up the garbage you have built up. I'm not I think we need to notify people, but if you've got an 8 or 11-year-old application and you haven't heard from them for a long time, it seems to me, unless there's some legal requirement, by legislature and by the statutes in California here or something, we don't have to notify necessarily everybody, but maybe someone with a permit that's sort of pending more or less recently, 3 years or something like that. But, if you have not heard from people for many years, why notify them? They've known, and how much notice do you have to give them? On the other hand, if it's not a big burden, why not?
Okay. I had concerns similar to the public's concern about this agenda item from the standpoint of the the agenda item as put on the item is put on the agenda and I think the public notices. Didn't mention, and I know you may see this as a clerical error, but didn't mention the Ridgeline Development Code section by name. It refers to 17.060 as the Hill Area Residential Overlay, which is 17060 is actually the Ridgeline Development, and Hill Area is 17072. So the agenda item as described wasn't clear and specifically addressing all of the sections that were being looked at for changing. We only received attachment B and C Tuesday. So, I mean, that was hard, I think, for the commission to read through those items between Tuesday night and tonight to discuss that, and certainly not enough time for the public to get those and then understand what is being looked at here. I agree. I mean, I support putting limits on applications, and I support the concept here, but I think I couldn't support what we have here tonight. I think we need to have more notice so the public gets the corrected information. I'd like staff to look at the zoning permits and the sign permits and reviewing those for applicability here. In general, and we know that we have a lot of areas in the code that either need clerical changes or things like that, but it seems that we're always just doing this piecemeal. So when we have an opportunity, when we make a change and we have an opportunity, for example, the Hill Area chapter where there is that one sentence in there that doesn't make any sense. So when we're looking at making a change to a chapter for a specific purpose, which I support, we should be taking the time to look at that for those types of issues so that, that comes off the list of things we need to look at and correct, and we're done with that. On the enforcement piece, I understand, needing a difference in time between that and regular extensions, but I'm a little concerned that as it reads now, that it only allows one 90-day extension approved by the planning director. And I think there could be circumstances where that, for a valid reason, that may not be sufficient. And so I would like staff to look at perhaps allowing 2 of those or something else so that you're not at that point where you've got a code enforcement, the applicant's trying to do the right thing, but because of what it is, that 90 days may not be sufficient, and then you're left kind of like, okay, it's 90 days, and I've given the one 90-day extension, and there's nothing in the code that perhaps allows some discretion with the planning director maybe to issue another one or something, and have that workable. All of these, I think we need to look at these chapters that we're changing as far as cleaning up what an application is in these and referencing 14.040.100, because it seems we're taking care of one piece of the chapter but not the other chapter, so we're there with the same language of what, an application filed, then Planning Commission has 45 days to do whatever. That, I can come in, look for a variance, I see that. That doesn't, to me, talk anything about an application filed being considered complete or officially filed. And I think if we're going to go to those chapters and reference the section on the vesting and the time limits, then we should make sure that we're clear on the application, the official application, or when an application is considered complete, to marry those up. And then going back to just, if we're looking at a chapter to make significant changes to it, then we should take that opportunity to make the changes, such as the one on the Hill area, the 1707260 and fix it while we're in there making changes, because otherwise, it's never going to get fixed. So those were my comments. As far as going forward, do we have any motions anyone would like to put forth on this?
Can I make another comment?
Sure.
Before we go there. This is not on. I agree with Laura. I won't get into the detail of my experience with some of these bigger projects that do require discretionary review or variances. All I can say is that the economy has a lot to do with how long things take. Things ebb and flow depending on what's going on with the economy, and the fires kind of have something to do with that. So I think, I think the planning director should have some discretion, but I do think that 180 days would be more appropriate, because engineers and other design professionals are getting involved earlier in the process now. So that takes time. Everybody's busy and you have to coordinate everybody. So, and then there's a redesign effort. I think that's what maybe Laura was talking about, especially when they find out they can't afford the project. So there are many things that contribute to that, and I think 180 days would be more reasonable. I hear very specific, I guess recommendations or comments about, the clock resetting, and I think sometimes general is better in the code, because if we get too specific about, when the clock resets, then it does really lock you, into a position where people can just keep applying, submitting over and over again until they have all the pieces, just to get that time extension. I know the way other towns deal with this is by applying fees after the third review. So it doesn't have to be said, but the design professional or the owner that submits realizes that maybe they have 3 shots before they start getting, billed hourly for staff's time. And that would kind of take care of the problem, I think. And maybe we don't have to be that specific about clocks resetting. So it's just kind of a comment, taking away from everybody's feedback.
It sounds like the commission has concerns, questions, and it almost sounds like I'm hearing that we would like to see this continued and come back to us. Do we have a motion to that effect?
I will move to continue. Not sure what the resolution number is, looking at these, but just for extensions, for discretionary permits, or at least what was presented before us. I think if we could consolidate the corrections and maybe incorporate some of the comments, not, for another draft.
I think it would also be important to give the public another opportunity to weigh in on this matter as well.
I agree. There was There was a question about, and I'm sort of jumping in, and maybe I should wait till the motion gets seconded. So I'll wait on that. Do I have a second?
I'll second that motion.
Okay, discussion on that, but before I lose my train of thought, there was a comment about notifying individuals that would be in this situation for the hearing. I don't know if that's feasible, but it sounds like, and I don't know how many we have, that it might be prudent for a notice for the next meeting to go to those individuals as well.
In general, I agree with that. The concern I have is if we miss an application, we do the notices in all the places, so we will make a good faith effort, and I'm sure we'll catch most of them. It's just, if we miss one or two that are hiding in some file cabinet somewhere, don't blame us.
Okay, did I get a second? Sorry. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And I would ask, and it might help staff, if we have questions or specifics. I'm sure staff would be delighted to get our emails so that they can address a lot of our comments and questions that we had before the next meeting.
When you say these code sections, I'm trying to write notes, and so we have to sometimes all talk, and we still don't get it down unless we have to go back and watch the meeting. And so if you have it written down, we can just, like Cindy used a code section that I can't find. I'm sure it's in there.
Can I request a short break before we
Yes, ma'am.
continue? Okay. On page 2, the very first paragraph, we talk about, it says the application was continued from the March 21st meeting, but this is the March 21st meeting, so I'm not quite sure what meeting we were continued from. Okay, so that was one comment. Okay, Mimi isn't here to clarify, but I think she had a question about what would happen if the updated survey found spotted owl nests and the Napa false indigo. Oh, on page 4, I'm sorry. Her, under Commissioner Newton, the second bullet point. Because I think it's kind of confusing the way the sentence says, but Mimi's not here to verify that's what she said, but I believe it's what would happen to the construction period. And I don't know, I circled, because at some point we talk about, they mentioned the survey and then talking about a new one, and I think it's not clear when did we decide that there needed to be a new survey, and I think it was determined like during the building permit process, but maybe that makes sense if anyone needs to.
I think your way makes more sense, because what I thought you guys made the condition is that they have to provide those before the building permit is issued.
Correct.
And
So
that
during
will
the
determine when construction is going to occur.
yeah.
So your way is clear.
So anyway, so that's what I circled because I thought it was confusing, I think, the way that it was stated in here. Okay, and then, I don't know, maybe Esther can comment about on page 5, the bullet point number 2. And so you can maybe confirm that you tried to turn around everything, but.
Right, I
think
I was just looking at that. I say it is unrealistic to try to turn everything around that has been discussed tonight, or I'm sorry, to turn everything that has been discussed tonight in 90 days. And I think what I was trying to say is that we didn't want to continue the project, that we wanted to leave it to the staff's discretion to I think, review some of these items, like the biology report. So I don't know how, I think maybe it should just say to turn around tonight's, or okay, so then after the 90 days, I would just say, Planning Commissioner recommends that we not continue the project, but rather allow for staff to use their discretion to review some of these items.
Okay, and then I had on page 6, under my, Commissioner Caroline, under bullet point 1, we talk about the paint colors would be brown, then green, and then I think it's supposed to be then gray. I think that's just a typo.
Oh, okay, got
And then on the motion, I don't know, I think it's confusing the way it's worded about the body color be brown or green, and the staff and the applicant shall decide. Is that, I don't remember if that was what ultimately was, if that was correct.
I believe that's correct, because they had
Okay.
white trim, and so you guys indicated your body color, but indicated you thought it was okay for staff to pick a trim color that worked
Okay.
with whichever body color they
All right.
went with.
So I just want to make sure that was reflected correctly. And then on page 11, under my comment, bullet point 1, what I was trying to say is that this project had been thoroughly peer reviewed by the town's engineering consultant. I think that was important to say because of the special circumstances of the site. And that's all that I have.
Esther, did you have any more?
I'm going through back to page 5, because as it goes on, we approved the project. I was trying to figure out which review or which, hearing this was. But the last bullet on page 5 under Commissioner Gonzalez-Barber, I think it says she is leaning towards supporting the project, but would support a continuance if, and I would say if applicant agreed. I think that's it for this hearing.
Michelle or Phil?
I have
Oh, you're not, yeah. So do we have a motion?
Just for this one? Yeah. Okay.
Ones.
So I motion to approve the draft minutes for the meeting of March 21st, 2019, with the corrections that have been noted.
Second?
I second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, the second one is April 21st. Mimi was absent and Laura was absent. And I have a note here that Esther had asked for these to be continued, so you could research one of your comments.
Right,
Was that March 21st in the minutes?
no, I think we're looking at April 11th.
Sorry, April 21st.
No,
Oh, 11th, or it's
11th,
either
April
April 11th or
11th.
March 21st.
My apologies, April 11th.
Okay.
okay, so I just wanted to make sure that I went on the record explaining why I changed my mind about the cannabis adult use retail. And so that is on page 3 at the bottom. And I mean, apparently I, stated a lot of reasons why I had changed my mind. I was trying to figure out how to condense that. So I would just say, and maybe you can go back to the video or I can send this to you in an email, but it basically boils down to Commissioner Gonzalez-Parber stated she had very serious concerns and has changed her mind about recommending adult use retail. She does not believe Fairfax is ready for for this type of business due to impacts to traffic, crime, and our youth. Planning Commissioner would like to have input from our police, fire, and EMS departments before making a recommendation to the town council. So that was one, and I can send that. There was a lot said, and I thought maybe I had imagined it, but I did say it. And on page number 5, Commissioner Gonzalez-Parber provided the comments. It's like 1, 2, 3 down. This is regarding the number of plants. And I think the second bullet says it could be more than, or it could be 6 or up to 18 plants with a doctor's recommendation. So I think I was approving the 6 or more if there was a medical recommendation. I think those were the major ones. I think I'm okay with everything else.
Any other comments?
I have on page 5 of April 11th, Commissioner Green provided the following comments. It's the second one down. 18 plants outdoors would be like a Christmas tree lot, so the word outdoors was missing.
For me, page 6, under Commissioner Rodriguez, first bullet, she supports reducing the number of retail uses to 1, so it's missing of retail uses.
Do I have a motion to approve with changes?
Motion to approve with changes.
I second the motion.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
No,
Opposed?
I don't think it's ready for us to approve it.
Did you have more changes to it?
No, I think the quantity that we've given is too much for the staff to get it all down, and that it's going to go forward with an adequate review on our part.
So are you saying you want them to come back with the changes in them?
I already voted no.
All right. Motion carries. The third set and last set, May 16th, Commissioner Green was absent.
I didn't note any corrections from my,
Anyone else?
I did not have any corrections either.
Do I have a motion?
I move to approve the minutes
Second?
from May 16, 2019.
Second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Planning Director's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the commission. Briefly, Commissioner Gonzalez-Parber requested an update on the crosswalk. I forget the name of the side street, but at Bolinas, that's in front of the CBD shop. And I did contact or discuss this with the town manager. He indicated that it's a kind of a two-step process because there's, in addition to the crosswalk, there's also some curbing to consider, and that they are in the process of applying for grants, so it kind of depends on if we get the grant funding. So you may see some action on that, or you may not, depending on whether funding becomes available. I also wanted to bring the commission up to date. At the last town council meeting, they authorized staff to apply for Senate Bill 2 grants. And briefly, what's happened is with the flurry of housing-related legislation at the state, they've kind of recognized that there's been a really substantial burden placed on local planning departments. And that further, that in some instances, their decrees have overridden other state laws, for example, where they require you to do general plan housing elements, and the housing elements very specifically and carefully designate areas for development, and then they just come along and say, and SB 35 says, you know, you shall approve up to this and that. So what they've done is said, hey, we're going to give you some money if you want to apply for grants this year to try to address these housing initiatives. And so we've, the council has provided authorization for staff to do so. I'm part of a Marin County Planning Directors Group, and when we were discussing these various housing requirements in the context of the SB2 grant availability, we realized we're all kind of in the same boat, and specifically with respect to three topics. One is objective development standards. The second has to do with accessory dwelling units, and the third has to do with inclusionary housing. And so we agreed it would be a good idea, rather than kind of divide and conquer, and believe me, there is a tremendous demand for work in these areas. I mean, every community is realizing that if we don't come up with these objective development standards, somebody's just going to walk in with their building permit application and say, process it, and process it quickly, and you're not going to have much say. So long story short, it was agreed that we would have a collaborative effort in hiring consultants. The county's housing people are heading up that effort. And in those three areas, we have 8 to 11 jurisdictions that have all agreed to financially support, through their various SB2 grant applications, funding towards efforts at providing objective development standards for every community. It will consist of workbooks in many cases. With respect to inclusionary housing for jurisdictions that don't have that, it will create it, and this is something that your town council has already identified as a goal. So it's kind of neat when, you know, somebody says, hey, here's some money to do something that you have to do, and then we've got this program where it'll be a collaborative effort, and they will be looking at each jurisdiction's, for example, their inclusionary housing. They will be doing, there's kind of a nexus and proportionality study. You can't just say, oh, make 50% of all housing developments be affordable. You have to say, to determine that it won't have an adverse impact on the provision of housing. So they will do those requisite studies. So I'm very enthusiastic about that. In terms of ADUs, it'll be more along the lines of a workbook. I'm also optimistic that we can put in some aspects that relate specifically to Fairfax. In terms of objective development standards, again, it'll be a workbook approach. They will look at each jurisdiction's circumstances. Of course, Fairfax, with its historic downtown area, that's a major concern, and that's something that staff has already initiated work, and I'll loop back to that in a minute. But the idea is that there will be outreach in the community and conversations before your commission and the town council in the preparation of specific standards that apply to Fairfax. So there'll be a general workbook and then more specific items. And there will definitely be a historic orientation towards that. So stay tuned on that. I don't have a lot of details at this time, but we do have some funding, and which is exceptionally rare. I'm sure Commissioner Rodriguez can attest to this, that you almost never get money to do planning work. It's always build this or do that. And I think next year that planning funding goes away, and it's more towards providing these types of projects. So we will be doing some work, and there will be a lot of conversation built into that effort.
What kind of time frame are you thinking for that project?
It'll probably start off with the objective development standards. San Anselmo had that one project that basically got foisted upon them, and I haven't been in East Bay much, but I've heard anecdotally that 5-story buildings are popping up all over the East Bay that are basically SB 35 projects with limited or no local input, 5-story housing complexes. So everybody's really anxious to develop this. That'll be their first phase. Probably in the next year, we'll have a work product completed. So the process will be occurring during this next year. And let's see, there was one other thing, and I said
Historical?
Yes, historical. As suspected, Cassidy has become very busy with other work priorities, and in addition, some of the volunteer efforts that she was hoping to obtain haven't necessarily come through. So what I will likely be doing is working a little bit with her to come up with a local version of what we think we should be exploring for historic preservation efforts in Fairfax, and roll that into the objective development standards grant so that we can hire professionals to help us do that work. And that's it, unless people have questions.
Thank you. Commissioner comments and requests?
I'm not going to be available. I'm going to be on vacation the next meeting, so I just want to, I don't know if anyone else has conflicts that meeting.
I want to, I'm glad the town has improved the parkade. Some things, though, that have been needed there aren't there now, and I think we need to take another look. So, for example, the stairs down to, at the end of the parkade, near the exit, the stairs down across the theater, there's no handicap parking or access down there. And it's kind of, it kind of tends towards going across Sir Francis Drake, it seems, more. So I would recommend some kind of handicap access spaces, perhaps closer to the area of the theater in the parkade. That's my really only comment there.
Yes, I know that they provided that at the Bolinas intersection. In fact, that was one of the items that some people felt it was adequate. It didn't meet the minimum slope standard, or it wasn't less than the maximum slope. So they invested some money dealing with ramping. I mean, it may be something as simple as striping. I will refer your comments to the town manager, and if he wants to talk to you about that, or I'll just relay it at the next meeting.
Yeah, I believe it's probably that doesn't, down on that end, there's not the ramp. There's only the one ramp that's at the.
Right.
So I don't know, if some cities, they put a handicap space at the curb. So maybe there's opportunity to put some handicap spaces on Broadway down towards that end of the street where the movie theater is.
Yeah, I know a lot of factors went into the decisions, consideration decisions on design, and some of it was driven by money. You hate to use that as a rationale, but it may be that it's just they had a very limited amount of funding to work with, and I think they were just trying to be as proactive, bang for buck wise, but I'll confirm that and get back to your commission.
And the theater itself has handicap spaces too, so. Any other comments, requests?
Just going back to the historic downtown, it would be really great once you get a handle on the timeline for production of the workbook, if we could somehow support you in providing some kind of a public workshop where historic feedback can be provided, or something that can contribute, if you don't have that financially built into your work plan. But I think some local input's going to be important. It'd also be good to see what's next on our work plan regarding the ridge lines or visual resource map, and kind of get that on the agenda and begin discussion of that.
I can let you know that after long discussions, we're in the process of getting a computer in-house that will enable us to do GIS work. And I've already had discussions with a consultant. So that's the first, is to take those wonderful McHargian paper maps from the 1970s and digitize them and geo-reference them. And there's a lot of work. So yeah, we're aware of that, and it doesn't just tie into the pending subdivision, which we're probably going to be going out with our RFP in the next month on. But yeah, it will assist in that as well. So we're aware that there are some 21st century needs with respect to our current general plan and some of the information that is shown there and how it ties into various projects.
Any other comments, requests? Great. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
I second the motion.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion. Thank you.